35 million automobiles. That's how many cars rolled off the assembly lines in Lansing, Michigan over 107 years. 35 million curved dashes, Rocket 80s, Cutlasses, and Toronados. 35 million vehicles that carried American families to work, to church, to Little League games, to funerals, to weddings. 35 million pieces of rolling American history. And today? Today there's nothing but concrete and weeds where 15,000 workers once punched the clock. This was the Lansing Car Assembly Plant, located at 1225 East Grand River Avenue. 3,677,000 square feet of American manufacturing might. At its peak in the mid-1960s, this single facility employed enough workers to fill a small city. 15,000 men and women running 2 and 3 shifts, producing up to 1,000 cars every single day. And what did it sell for in the end? Nothing. They demolished it. Tore it down brick by brick, steel beam by steel beam, between 2006 and 2007. Cost $10 million just to knock it down and haul it away. Your grandfather probably drove an Oldsmobile. Maybe your father did too. The Cutlass was the best-selling car in America for years. The Rocket 88. That was the car that invented rock and roll, the first muscle car, the machine that made teenagers believe in speed and freedom and the open American road. Not your father's Oldsmobile, the commercials said in the 1980s. Turns out, it wouldn't be anybody's Oldsmobile, not anymore. On December 12, 2000, General Motors made an announcement that shook Lansing, Michigan to its core. So after 107 years of continuous production, after being America's oldest automotive nameplate, Oldsmobile would be phased out, discontinued, killed. The last Oldsmobile, a dark cherry metallic 2004 Alero, rolled off the assembly line on April 29, 2004. It was purchased at auction by a Florida collector for $42,000. 107 years of American industrial history, and the final product sold for the price of a mid-range SUV. But here's the number that should haunt you. In 1999, the state of Michigan gave General Motors a $500 million grant to keep the Lansing operations alive. $500 million taxpayer dollars. And 5 years later, Oldsmobile was dead anyway. Where did that money go? We'll get to that. This is a story about the American dream, how it was built, how it thrived, and how it was destroyed. It's a story about workers who gave their entire lives to a company that promised them security, then abandoned them. It's a story about executives who made decisions in boardrooms that destroyed families in living rooms. It's a story about a city that was Oldsmobile, and what happens when the heart of a community just stops beating. For decades, working at Oldsmobile wasn't just a job in Lansing. It was an identity. Fathers brought sons to the hiring office. Mothers and daughters worked side by side on the trim line. There were families, we'll meet them, who had 3, 4, even 5 generations walking through those factory gates. I was proud to work here, one veteran told the Smithsonian. It felt like losing a family. That family had 15,000 members at its peak. When the doors finally closed, saying when the last shift walked out for the final time, when the padlocks went on the gates, the unemployment office couldn't handle the flood of applications. Property values cratered. Businesses that had served Oldsmobile workers for generations shuttered their windows. The tax base that funded schools and police and fire departments evaporated like morning dew. This wasn't just a factory closing. This was an extinction event. And here's what makes it worse. Oldsmobile didn't die because nobody wanted to buy cars. It didn't die because the workers stopped caring. It didn't die because American manufacturing suddenly became impossible. Oldsmobile died because of decisions made in Detroit boardrooms. Decisions that prioritized quarterly earnings over century-long legacies. Decisions that treated workers like line items on a spreadsheet instead of human beings with mortgages and families and dreams. By the time you finish watching this documentary, you'll understand exactly what happened. You'll meet the visionary who started it all in a converted barn in 1897. You'll see the golden age when Oldsmobile ruled American roads. You'll watch the warning signs that everyone ignored, and you'll witness the final, devastating collapse that scattered 15,000 families to the wind. But it didn't start this way. It started with a man named Ransom, a stack of lumber, and a dream that would change transportation forever. Ransom Eli Olds was born on June 3, 1864, in Geneva, Ohio. His father, Pliny Olds, was a blacksmith and machinist, a working man who understood that America was built with calloused hands and iron will. When Ransom was 5 years old, the family moved to Lansing, Michigan, where Pliny opened a machine shop. That machine shop would become the birthplace of an American legend. Picture Lansing in the 1890s, a small city of maybe 13,000 people. The state capital, yes, but a long way from the industrial might of Detroit or Chicago. Streets were unpaved. Horses pulled everything. The future, this thing called the automobile that a few eccentric inventors were tinkering with in workshops across America and Europe, seemed like a rich man's toy. Ransom Olds saw something different. He saw the future. "I wanted to make a car for the average American," Olds later said. "Not a plaything for millionaires. Not a curiosity for world's fairs. A real, practical, affordable vehicle that working people could actually own." By the early 1890s, Olds was building experimental vehicles in his father's shop. Steam-powered at first, then gasoline. He wasn't alone. Dozens of inventors across the country were racing toward the same goal. But Olds had something the others lacked, a manufacturing mindset. He didn't just want to build one car. He wanted to build thousands. On August 21, 1897, Ransom Olds founded the Olds Motor Vehicle Company in Lansing, Michigan. The initial investment was approximately $15,000, about $550,000 in today's money. Local investors scraped together the capital, betting on this 33-year-old tinkerer's vision. The first year was modest. 4 cars built. 4. You could count the entire year's production on one hand. But Olds wasn't discouraged. He knew the technology worked. He just needed scale. In 1899, a wealthy copper mining magnate named Samuel L. Smith bought into the company, providing $199,600 in capital, a fortune at the time. The company was renamed Olds Motor Works, and operations expanded. A new factory was built in Detroit, closer to suppliers and transportation networks. And then disaster struck. On March 9, 1901, fire swept through the Detroit factory. The blaze destroyed almost everything: machinery, tools, blueprints, completed vehicles. In a matter of hours, Olds Motor Works was reduced to ashes and rubble. But one thing survived. A single prototype of a small, light, affordable vehicle had been pushed out of the burning building by a quick-thinking worker. This was the curved-dash Oldsmobile, and it would become the first mass-produced gasoline automobile in American history. Faced with ruins, Olds made a decision that would change manufacturing forever. Rather than try to rebuild everything in-house, he contracted out component production to other shops. The engine went to the Dodge brothers. Yes, those Dodge brothers, John and Horace, who won the transmission contract in 1901 and would later found their own automotive empire. What emerged was something revolutionary, an early form of assembly line production. Components arrived from multiple suppliers. Workers specialized in specific tasks. Vehicles moved through the factory in a systematic flow. Henry Ford gets credit for perfecting the assembly line, but Ransom Olds pioneered it. The results were staggering. In 1901, the year of the fire, Olds Motor Works sold 635 curved-dash automobiles at $650 each, about $23,000 per vehicle in today's money. Total revenue? Approximately $412,750. By 1904, annual production had exploded to over 5,000 vehicles. The curved dash wasn't just successful, it was a phenomenon. The little car that almost burned up became the best-selling automobile in America. And it wasn't just the wealthy buying them. The curved dash was priced for the emerging middle class. Doctors bought them to make house calls faster. Farmers bought them to get to town and back. Salesmen bought them to cover more territory. For the first time in history, average Americans could imagine owning a car. "In My Merry Oldsmobile," a popular song from 1905, captured the cultural moment. The automobile wasn't just transportation anymore. It was freedom. It was romance. It was the American future, and Oldsmobile was leading the way. But success brought conflict. By 1904, Ransom Olds was clashing with his investors, including Samuel Smith and Smith's son Frederick, over the company's direction. Olds wanted to keep building affordable cars for average Americans. The Smiths wanted to move upmarket, toward luxury vehicles with higher profit margins. The founder lost that battle. In 1904, Ransom Olds left the company he had created. He went on to found REO Motor Company, his initials, and continued building vehicles for decades. But Olds Motor Works carried on without him, the name becoming bigger than the man who created it. In 1908, a cigar-chomping dealmaker named William Durant was assembling a new kind of enterprise. Durant had already taken over Buick and was dreaming of a massive automotive combine that would dominate the industry. On November 12, 1908, Olds Motor Works became part of General Motors. The acquisition price isn't publicly recorded, but the implications were enormous. Oldsmobile was no longer an independent company. It was a division, one voice among many in an ever-growing automotive giant. For the next 96 years, Oldsmobile's fate would be determined in Detroit, not Lansing. But in those early years, nobody worried about that. General Motors brought capital, brought resources, brought national distribution. The Lansing factory expanded, employment grew, the future looked limitless. By the 1920s, Oldsmobile was producing vehicles with innovations that defined the industry. The first chrome-plated trim in 1926. The first standard windshield on an automobile. Patents on manufacturing processes that competitors rushed to license. And in Lansing, the factory at 1225 East Grand River Avenue was becoming something more than a workplace. It was becoming a community. Families were building their lives around steady paychecks. Children were growing up knowing exactly where they would work when they graduated high school. The American dream was being manufactured right alongside the automobiles. This was just the beginning. If you grew up in mid-century America, you knew the sound. That low, rumbling growl of a rocket V8 engine. That was the sound of Saturday nights and Sunday drives. The sound of prosperity. The sound of a nation that believed it could build anything better than anyone else. And for a while, that was true. In 1949, the Oldsmobile introduced the Rocket 88. It was quite simply revolutionary. A lightweight body mated to a powerful new overhead valve V8 engine. The combination created what automotive historians consider the first true muscle car. Before Mustangs, before Camaros, before GTOs, there was the Rocket 88. Jackie Brenston's 1951 song Rocket 88, often credited as one of the first rock and roll records ever made, was an ode to this machine. The automobile and the music that defined a generation arrived together, inseparable, roaring into the American consciousness. But Oldsmobile wasn't resting on one iconic model. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the division produced vehicle after vehicle that defined American aspirations. The 1961 Cutlass arrived as a compact, an affordable option, and it would eventually become one of the best-selling nameplates in automotive history. By the time Cutlass production ended, over 11 million had been sold. 11 million. That's more than the entire population of Michigan. In 1964, the 442 debuted. 4-barrel carburetor, 4-speed transmission, dual exhaust. This was Oldsmobile's answer to the muscle car wars, and it could hold its own against anything coming out of Pontiac or Chevrolet. Young men who couldn't afford a Corvette could still own something that would make their hearts race. And then there was the 1966 Toronado, a front-wheel drive personal luxury coupe that won every design award imaginable. President Lyndon B. Johnson owned one. The Toronado wasn't just a car. It was a statement that American engineering had no limits. Not your father's Oldsmobile was still decades away. In these golden years, Oldsmobile was exactly what your father drove, and your grandfather, and your uncle, and your neighbors. Market share peaked at roughly 10% of all American automobile sales in the 1950s. 1 out of every 10 cars on American roads wore that rocket emblem. The advertising campaigns were legendary. Television commercials featuring smiling families, magazine spreads in Life and Look and Saturday Evening Post. Celebrities and everyday Americans alike, all united by the same aspiration, to own an Oldsmobile. And behind every one of those vehicles was the Lansing factory. 3,677,000 square feet. 77 acres. Enough floor space to contain more than 60 football fields. Then this was the Lansing car assembly plant at its zenith, a manufacturing cathedral dedicated to the religion of American industry. Picture the production floor in 1965. The line never stops. Not for lunch, not for breaks, not for anything short of catastrophe. Workers have exactly 60 seconds to complete their task before the next vehicle arrives. Install the door panel. Tighten 14 bolts. Move to the next car. Do it again, and again, and again. 8 hours straight. At peak production, this plant could produce up to 1,000 vehicles every single day. That's more than 40 cars per hour. 1 car every 90 seconds, rolling off the line, complete and road-ready. The technology was cutting edge for its era. Automated welding systems joined body panels with precision impossible by hand. Conveyor systems moved components through the vast facility with choreographed efficiency. The paint shop alone required climate control systems that rivaled hospital operating rooms. And the sound. Veterans of the factory talk about the sound. The percussion of pneumatic tools, the hiss of hydraulics, the rumble of moving steel. The human voices, calling out, joking, warning, barely audible above the mechanical symphony. You could feel it in your chest, one former worker recalled. Like a heartbeat. The whole building was alive. By the mid-1960s, total employment at the Lansing Oldsmobile operations had reached approximately 15,000 workers. That's not a factory. That's a small city. More people worked at this single plant than lived in many Michigan towns, and every one of those 15,000 workers had a name, a family, a story. Let's talk about what an Oldsmobile job meant in 1965. A man, and by the mid-1960s, increasingly women too, could walk into that factory at 18 years old with nothing but a high school diploma. No college, no special training, no family connections. Within a month, he'd be making more money than his father ever had. Within a year, he'd have enough saved for a down payment on a house. Within 5 years, he'd have a pension vesting, health insurance for his entire family, 3 weeks of paid vacation, and the security of knowing he'd never have to worry about where his next paycheck was coming from. Starting wages on the production line were approximately $15 per hour by the early 1970s. Adjust that for inflation, and you're looking at the equivalent of nearly $100 per hour today. Let that sink in. A factory job, no degree required, paying what today would be $200,000 per year. But it wasn't just the wages, it was everything that came with them. The United Auto Workers, Local 602, had negotiated contracts that seem almost mythical by today's standards. Full medical coverage, not just for the worker, but for spouses and children. Dental, vision, mental health services, pension benefits that promised 80% of your final salary for life after 30 years of service. Life insurance, paid sick leave, paid bereavement leave, education assistance if you wanted to take night classes, profit-sharing bonuses every year. And then there were the intangibles. Company-sponsored sports teams, bowling leagues, softball teams, even a Lansing Oldsmobile racing club, an annual company picnics where thousands of workers and their families gathered for food and games and the simple joy of community. The union had been hard-won. The 1937 sit-down strike at GM, one of the most significant labor actions in American history, had established the UAW's right to represent workers. The Battle of the Running Bulls that year saw 13 people wounded when police attacked strikers. Workers had literally bled for these benefits. And by the 1960s, those benefits had created something America had never seen before: a blue-collar middle class. Joe Martinez, not his real name, but his story is real, started at Oldsmobile in 1958. He was 20 years old, just married, expecting his first child. By 1965, he owned a 3-bedroom house on Lansing's south side, had 2 cars in the driveway, and was putting money away for his kids' college fund. "We weren't rich," he'd say later, "but we had everything we needed. I knew I could take care of my family. That was worth more than anything." The factory wasn't just employing individuals, it was employing dynasties. Multi-generational families were common. A father would retire after 30 years, and his son would already have a decade on the line. Some families had 3, 4, even 5 generations who had worked at Oldsmobile. "When my grandfather started there in the 20s, one third-generation worker recalled, he never imagined his great-grandson would work in the same building. That was our family legacy. That factory was our inheritance. And it wasn't just the workers, it was everyone connected to them. If you remember when America made the best cars in the world, when a factory job meant a house and a pension and a future, hit that subscribe button right now. We're documenting the rise and fall of American industry, one factory at a time. And trust me, this story gets much worse before it gets better." At its peak, Oldsmobile's annual payroll in Lansing approached $1 billion, billion with a B. Every 2 weeks, that money flooded into the local economy. Workers bought groceries, paid mortgages, ate at restaurants, purchased clothes, went to movies. Hundreds of supplier companies fed the Oldsmobile operation. Machine shops, tool and die makers, upholstery manufacturers, glass producers. Each of those suppliers had their own workers, their own payrolls, their own families, depending on the giant factory's continued operation. SOT estimates suggested that for every job at Oldsmobile, another 2 or 3 existed in the surrounding economy because of it. The tax revenue funded schools that educated workers' children. It paved roads and paid police and maintained parks. The factory was the town, and everyone knew it. Oldsmobile was the heart of Lansing, one former mayor would later say. Not was like, was. The two identities were inseparable. For decades, it seemed like this would last forever. It didn't. The first warning came from across an ocean. In 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an oil embargo against the United States. Within months, gas prices quadrupled. Lines at filling stations stretched for blocks. Suddenly, the big, beautiful, powerful V8 engines that Oldsmobile had perfected were liabilities. Americans who had never considered a foreign car started looking at Toyotas and Datsuns and Hondas. These Japanese vehicles were smaller, yes. Less powerful, absolutely. But they sipped fuel while American muscle cars guzzled it. Made in Japan had once been a punchline, synonymous with cheap imitation goods. By the end of the 1970s, it was a threat that Detroit couldn't laugh away anymore. The Japanese weren't just building fuel-efficient cars. They were building better cars. The quality gap that had seemed insurmountable in the 1960s was closing rapidly. Japanese manufacturers invested in robotics, in quality control, in worker training programs. They reduced defects. They improved reliability. Meanwhile, Detroit was struggling to adapt. Oldsmobile rushed smaller cars to market, the Omega, the Starfire, but they were afterthoughts, designed by committee, built without conviction. Buyers could tell. The small Oldsmobiles felt like what they were, big car thinking crammed into economy car bodies. And then came 1979, a second oil shock, another price spike, another punch to the gut of American automakers who had bet everything on big engines and big profits. But foreign competition wasn't the only problem. Maybe it wasn't even the main problem. Inside General Motors, a different kind of rot had set in. The corporation that had once prided itself on distinct brands with distinct identities was sliding towards something called badge engineering. Take one basic vehicle platform, slap different grills on it, call one a Chevrolet, call another a Pontiac, call a third an Oldsmobile, charge different prices, pretend they were different cars. Customers noticed, and the magic that had made people loyal to Oldsmobile, the sense that this brand stood for something unique, was dissolving. Why pay extra for an Oldsmobile when the Chevrolet underneath was identical? Worse, quality was slipping. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Oldsmobile faced recall after recall. Defects that Japanese competitors would never have allowed out the factory door became routine. Consumer Reports ratings dropped. J.D. Power surveys told a grim story of declining reliability. In the executive suites, short-term thinking had replaced long-term vision. Quarterly earnings mattered more than decade-long brand building. Wall Street demanded profits now, and GM delivered, by cutting corners on quality, by deferring maintenance on aging plants, by squeezing suppliers until they could barely stay in business. The Lansing plant, on once state-of-the-art, was showing its age. Equipment that should have been replaced was patched and repaired. Buildings that needed renovation received cosmetic fixes. The factory that had once been GM's crown jewel was becoming a liability, and there were strikes. The UAW and GM clashed repeatedly through the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. The 1945-46 strike had lasted 113 days. Smaller work stoppages interrupted production regularly. The relationship between labor and management that had once been tense but functional was becoming toxic. In 1984, workers reluctantly accepted increased automation in exchange for job security promises that would later prove hollow. The machines that were supposed to make American workers more productive were actually making them redundant. The first layoffs came quietly. A few hundred workers here, a few hundred there. Early retirement packages offered to anyone who would take them. The company called it right-sizing. Workers called it what it was, the beginning of the end. By the early 1990s, Oldsmobile's market share had cratered from its peak of 10% to barely 4%. And it was still falling. Every year, fewer Americans chose to buy an Oldsmobile. Every year, the brand felt less relevant, more outdated, more confused about what it even stood for. "Not your father's Oldsmobile," the desperate ad campaign proclaimed. They brought in celebrities. They targeted younger buyers. But the message was all wrong. Oldsmobile's loyal customers, the ones who had made the brand successful for decades, heard only rejection. And younger buyers weren't interested in a brand that seemed embarrassed by its own heritage. Unemployment at the Lansing plant dropped from 15,000 at its peak to under 10,000, then under 8,000, then under 5,000. Each round of cuts left survivors wondering if they'd be next. The supplier network that had grown up around Oldsmobile began to wither. Machine shops that had done nothing but Oldsmobile work for generations suddenly found themselves scrambling for contracts. Some survived by diversifying, many didn't. Through it all, management issued reassurances. Oldsmobile is committed to Lansing. We're investing in the future. The brand will survive. Workers wanted to believe it. The union wanted to believe it. The city of Lansing wanted to believe it. But the numbers didn't lie. Oldsmobile was dying. This is the point where I have to ask, are you still with me? I know enjoying isn't quite the right word for what we're watching here. This is genuinely heartbreaking. But if you appreciate deep-dive documentaries about the history that mainstream media won't cover, a like really helps other people find this video. We've got dozens of stories like this to tell, and your support makes that possible. In 1999, as rumors of Oldsmobile's demise grew louder, the state of Michigan stepped in with $500 million in grants and incentives to keep GM committed to Lansing. $500 million taxpayer dollars to save 15,000 jobs. The workers breathed a sigh of relief. The city celebrated. The governor touted the deal as proof that Michigan would fight for its manufacturing base. It bought them exactly 5 years. On December 12, 2000, General Motors made the announcement everyone had feared. Oldsmobile would be phased out. The breaking point came not with a bang, but with a spreadsheet. In the late 1990s, General Motors had 8 brands competing for increasingly scarce customers. Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac, Saturn, Hummer, Saab. Too many brands, too much overlap, too much cost. Consultants recommended consolidation. Wall Street demanded it. And when the numbers were run, when the projections were made, when the cold calculations were complete, Oldsmobile drew the short straw. The brand that had invented mass production. The oldest nameplate in American automotive history. The division that had been turning out cars since before World War I, before the Great Depression, before most of its competitors even existed. Gone. The decision wasn't made in Lansing. It wasn't made by anyone who had ever walked the factory floor or cashed a paycheck from Local 602. It was made in a boardroom in Detroit by executives whose primary loyalty was to the stock price. Later, analyses would question whether the decision was even necessary. Oldsmobile still sold nearly 300,000 vehicles in 2000. It wasn't thriving, but it wasn't dead. With proper investment, with better products, with a clearer brand identity, some argued it could have been saved. But proper investment would have cost money. Better products would have taken time. And General Motors wasn't interested in either. December 12, 2000, General Motors Chairman John Smith, Jr. announced that Oldsmobile would be phased out over the next several years. Production would continue through 2004, then cease entirely. The language was corporate, bloodless, phased out, not killed, not abandoned, not betrayed, phased out. In Lansing, workers heard the news on television sets and car radios. Rumors had been circulating for months, but somehow the official announcement still felt like a physical blow. It was like someone telling you your mother died, one 30-year veteran told reporters. Even when you know it's coming, it still knocks the wind out of you. The UAW responded with predictable outrage. "We fought for our jobs," union officials declared. "We gave everything to this company, and this is how they repay us." Mayor David Hollister called it a devastating blow to Lansing. City council members scrambled to understand the implications. Local businesses that depended on Oldsmobile workers began to panic. Approximately 4,000 workers remained at the Lansing assembly plant. Another 12,000 or more across North America faced uncertain futures as the phase-out progressed. Dealers, over 2,800 of them nationwide, suddenly had to plan for a future without new Oldsmobile inventory. And the $500 million Michigan had invested just 1 year earlier? Gone. A $500 million bet that had already lost. For the next 4 years, Oldsmobile existed in a twilight state, still producing vehicles, still employing workers. But everyone knew the end was coming. Sales plummeted as buyers avoided a dying brand. Why buy a car from a company that won't exist to service it? The death spiral accelerated exactly as economists predicted. In the factory, morale collapsed. Workers who had spent decades building these cars now wondered why they should bother. Quality, already struggling, suffered further. Some pride in craftsmanship gave way to the grind of marking time until the inevitable. Retirement packages were offered. Buyouts were accepted. The workforce shrank month by month as veterans took whatever they could get and walked away. And then came April 29, 2004. The final Oldsmobile, a dark cherry metallic Alero sedan, rolled off the assembly line at approximately 11:06 a.m. Workers gathered to watch. Some cried, some cheered ironically. Most just stood in silence, unable to process what they were witnessing. A small ceremony was held. Speeches were made. Someone noted that this was the end of 107 continuous years of Oldsmobile production, the longest run of any American automobile brand. The final car was shipped to the R.E. Olds Transportation Museum in Lansing, then later sold at auction. A Florida collector named Dean Leffler paid $42,000 for it. A piece of American history for the price of a moderately equipped new vehicle. The workers filtered out of the factory for the last time. No more shifts, no more overtime, no more paychecks. The padlocks went on the gates. For the approximately 4,000 workers who remained at the end, severance packages varied wildly. Those with long tenure, 20 or 30 years, received between 16 and 32 months of pay. Newer workers got far less. Some got almost nothing. Pension benefits, at least, were protected, for now. GM's pension funds were still solvent, and retirees would receive their promised payments. But workers who were forced out before reaching full retirement age faced reduced benefits. Years of expected payments vanished into actuarial calculations. The unemployment office in Lansing was overwhelmed. Case workers who normally handled a manageable load suddenly faced thousands of applications. The system designed for individual misfortune wasn't built for mass economic trauma. Meanwhile, the factory itself became a liability. 3.6 million square feet of industrial infrastructure sat idle. The equipment inside, once worth hundreds of millions, depreciated rapidly. Without maintenance, without climate control, the machines rusted and seized. Asset liquidation began almost immediately. Specialized manufacturing equipment was sold to other automakers, other industries, scrap dealers. Prices were pennies on the dollar. A robotic welding station that cost $500,000 to install might sell for $20,000. Real estate that had supported thousands of families now sat empty. But workers who had bought homes expecting decades of stable employment suddenly found themselves unable to make mortgage payments. For sale signs appeared on streets that had been bastions of middle-class stability for generations. The devastation was just beginning. Where do 4,000 workers go when the only job they've ever known disappears? Some transferred to other GM facilities. If they were lucky enough to have seniority, if positions were available, if they were willing to move their families hundreds of miles to chase shrinking opportunities. Many tried retraining programs. The state offered assistance. Community colleges designed courses for displaced auto workers. But the reality was brutal. Just a 55-year-old man who had spent 30 years on an assembly line couldn't easily become a computer programmer or a nurse or anything else the new economy demanded. I went back to school, one former worker recalled, got a certificate in something I can barely remember now, applied for jobs I wasn't qualified for. Companies looked at my resume and saw auto worker, like that was a disease. Age discrimination was rampant and relentless. Workers in their 50s, with decades of experience and reliability, found themselves unemployable. Too old to retrain, they were told. Too young to retire. Caught in an impossible gap between the life they'd built and the future they'd been promised. The statistics told a grim story. Studies of displaced auto workers showed that only a fraction found comparable employment. Many took jobs paying 30%, each 40%, even 50% less than their factory wages. Health benefits vanished, pensions evaporated. The middle-class life that Oldsmobile had provided was simply gone. Personal bankruptcy filings spiked in the Lansing area after 2004. Families who had built their lives around Oldsmobile paychecks couldn't adjust fast enough to the new reality. Mortgages went unpaid, credit cards maxed out, the financial infrastructure of thousands of households collapsed. Foreclosures followed. Homes that workers had purchased with decades of saved wages were seized by banks. Neighborhoods that had been stable for generations saw exodus and decay. And then there were the invisible casualties: stress, depression, anxiety, substance abuse. The emotional toll of sudden economic displacement doesn't appear in government statistics, but it was real, and it was devastating. My father never recovered, one worker's son told interviewers years later. Physically, he was fine, but something broke inside him when that plant closed. He wasn't the same person anymore. I want to hear from you in the comments right now. Did you work at Oldsmobile? Did your family? What do you remember about this plant, this company, this era of American manufacturing? This history deserves to be preserved, and your stories matter more than you know. Share them below. I read every single one. A factory doesn't die alone. It takes an entire ecosystem with it. The unemployment rate in the Lansing metropolitan area spiked in the years following the closure. The city that had enjoyed prosperity for decades now faced genuine economic crisis. Population declined. Young people who might have followed their parents into factory jobs instead followed opportunity out of Michigan entirely. The brain drain that had been a trickle became a flood. Property values in working-class Lansing neighborhoods fell by double digits. Homes that had been worth $150,000 sold for $80,000, if they sold at all. The tax base that funded city services shrank accordingly. Schools felt the impact immediately. Lower property values meant lower property taxes meant lower school funding. Class sizes increased. Programs were cut. The educational opportunities that had helped Oldsmobile workers send their children to college began to evaporate. Businesses that had served Oldsmobile workers for generations closed their doors. The diner where machinists ate breakfast. The hardware store that sold tools for home projects. The bars where third-shift workers unwound at 7 a.m. One by one, they posted closing signs and joined the exodus. Hundreds of supplier companies faced their own crises. Machine shops that had done nothing but Oldsmobile work for decades suddenly found themselves without customers. Some pivoted. Most couldn't. Crime statistics increased in the years following the closure. Economic desperation has predictable consequences. Property crimes, drug offenses, domestic disturbances. The social fabric that stable employment had maintained was fraying. The opioid epidemic that would devastate much of industrial America found fertile ground in communities like Lansing. Workers who had once found meaning in their labor now found only pain, and too many medicated that pain with substances that destroyed what remained of their lives. The Lansing car assembly plant stood empty for only 2 years before the decision was made to tear it down. Between 2006 and 2007, demolition crews dismantled 107 years of American industrial history. The process cost approximately $10 million, a fraction of what the facility had cost to build and expand over the decades, but still a significant investment in destruction. The stated reason was environmental remediation. A century of automotive manufacturing had left contamination in the soil and groundwater. The buildings themselves contained asbestos and other hazardous materials common in industrial construction of that era. But the practical reason was simpler. The building was worth more as cleared land than as an abandoned factory. GM, working through the Racer Trust that managed former GM properties, saw no value in preservation. No historical designation was sought or granted. The National Register of Historic Places, which has preserved far less significant structures, never considered the birthplace of mass automotive production. Today, the site at 1225 East Grand River Avenue is unrecognizable. The 77 acres have been partially redeveloped. Some portions support GM's Cadillac operations. A final irony, as the brand that replaced Oldsmobile in GM's lineup now occupies land that Oldsmobile built. The R.E. Olds Transportation Museum in Lansing preserves artifacts and memories. Vintage Oldsmobiles gleam under careful lighting. Old photographs show the factory in its glory days. But the museum is small. Attendance is modest. The history it preserves feels increasingly distant. Let's do the math that nobody in corporate boardrooms wanted to calculate. In 1965, a worker at the Lansing Oldsmobile plant could support a family of 4 on a single income. Buy a house, own 2 cars, take annual vacations, save for retirement, send kids to college, and still have money left over for a fishing boat or a cabin up north. That worker had an 8th grade education. No college, no specialized training, just a willingness to show up and do the work. Today, that same worker would need a bachelor's degree just to get an interview for a job that pays half as much in real terms. They'd need a second income in the household. They'd have crushing student debt. They'd rent instead of own. And retirement? A fantasy. This is what was lost. Not just a factory. Not just 15,000 jobs. An entire way of life. An economic covenant that said, if you work hard and stay loyal, you will be okay. The dignity of making something real with your hands. The pride of seeing a finished product roll off the line, knowing that your labor was part of it. The security of benefits negotiated by a union that actually had power. The community of people who worked together for decades, who knew each other's families, who showed up at each other's weddings and funerals, all gone. It would be easy to blame GM executives for destroying Oldsmobile, and they deserve blame. The short-term thinking, the badge engineering, the failure to invest in the brand, the willingness to sacrifice century-long legacies for quarterly earnings, all of that was a choice, made by people, with names and faces and 7-figure compensation packages. But the truth is more complicated. Trade policies enabled companies to chase cheap labor overseas. NAFTA, which was signed in 1994, opened the floodgates for manufacturing relocation. Politicians of both parties championed free trade, while communities like Lansing paid the price. Technology made workers increasingly replaceable. The automation that unions had accepted in exchange for job security promises kept eliminating jobs. The robots that were supposed to make American workers more productive just made them less necessary. Wall Street's relentless demand for short-term profits distorted every decision. Executives who might have invested in long-term brand building instead cut costs to juice quarterly numbers. Stock prices mattered more than stakeholder welfare. And yes, consumers played a role too. American buyers who once insisted on American products gradually accepted that made in USA was optional. The Toyotas and Hondas that took market share from Oldsmobile succeeded because Americans bought them. Everyone played a part. Everyone bears responsibility. But the consequences weren't shared equally. Executives who destroyed Oldsmobile retired wealthy. Workers who built it struggled. The Oldsmobile brand name still belongs to General Motors. It sits in a vault somewhere, unused, occasionally the subject of speculation about a possible revival that never comes. In the collector market, vintage Oldsmobiles command respect and real money. A pristine 442 from the muscle car era can sell for $80,000 or more. Rocket 80s are prized possessions. Even humbler models, the family sedans and station wagons of ordinary American life, find appreciative owners who value the craftsmanship and history. The IRE, Olds Transportation Museum, continues its work of preservation. Annual reunions bring together former workers who share memories and mourn what was lost. Facebook groups connect Oldsmobile enthusiasts across the country. Books have been written, documentaries have been made, academic papers have analyzed what happened and why. The story of Oldsmobile has become part of the larger narrative of American deindustrialization, one case study among hundreds, one factory among thousands. If this story affected you, if it made you angry or sad or nostalgic for an America that actually made things, then we've done our job. But here's the thing. There are hundreds of factories just like this one all across America, with stories that need to be told before the people who lived them are gone. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The link to support this research is in the description. These videos take weeks to make, but they're worth it to preserve this history. And drop a comment. What American company do you want us to cover next? What factory? What story deserves to be remembered? And similar closures continue happening. Right now, somewhere in America, a factory is announcing layoffs. A community is bracing for impact. A family is wondering how they'll make the mortgage. The Oldsmobile story isn't ancient history. It's a warning that remains relevant. If you drive down East Grand River Avenue in Lansing today, you won't find the factory your grandfather might have worked in. The 77 acres that once housed 3.6 million square feet of American manufacturing might are almost unrecognizable. Some sections have been redeveloped. Some sit empty. The demolition was thorough. Almost nothing remains. But if you know where to look, you can find the markers of what was lost. The R.E. Olds Transportation Museum sits just a few blocks away. Inside, volunteers, many of them former workers, maintain a collection that spans the entire 107-year history. The curved dash that started it all. The Rocket 88 that defined an era. The last Alero that ended it. The docents there will tell you stories if you ask. About the sound of the factory at shift change. About the smell of hot metal and cutting oil. About the friendships formed and the lives built. They'll tell you about their fathers and grandfathers who worked the same lines they did. And if you listen closely, you can hear the pride in their voices. Not nostalgia, though there's that too. Pride in what they built, in what they accomplished, in the contribution they made to American life. Lansing survived, as cities do. It diversified. Michigan State University, just down the road, provides economic stability. State government employment offers jobs that factories no longer do. New industries have arrived, though none that match what was lost. The neighborhoods where Oldsmobile workers lived are still there. Some have recovered, some haven't. The houses are a little older, a little smaller than the McMansions in the suburbs. But they still shelter families. Life continues. And across America, in garages and car shows and cruise nights, Oldsmobiles still run. The Cutlasses and 442s and Toronados that workers built with their hands still carry families down American roads. The engines still rumble. The chrome still shines. That's something no corporate decision can take away. The products endure. even when the company doesn't. Stand on that empty lot on East Grand River Avenue, and you might hear ghosts. The pneumatic rhythm of the assembly line. The voices of 15,000 workers calling out over the noise. The sound of vehicles rolling off the line, one every 90 seconds, each one somebody's dream of American prosperity. That sound is gone now. It's not coming back. The factory that made it was demolished, and the world that made such places possible has changed irrevocably. But stand there anyway. Remember what was built here. Remember who built it. Remember that for 107 years, American workers showed up at these gates, punched the clock, and created something real, something you could touch and drive and pass down to your children. And this is what remains of their legacy. An empty lot, a museum, some rusting machines scattered to the winds, and the memory of a time when America made the best cars in the world, and the people who made them could afford to buy them. Don't let this be forgotten. Don't let this happen again.